Welcome to SAM Conversation, a program of South Asia Monitor. Our topic today is the future of Afghanistan and implications for the region. We have with us Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya, who was the ambassador in who was in Afghanistan with the first, when we set up the embassy and the consulates. We have Major General B.K. Sharma, Director of the United Service Institution of India, and Dr. Omar Sadr of the Afghan Institute of Strategic Studies, and currently also in the American Institute of Afghanistan. When one looks back as a product of who was born after independence, one recalls the 50s and 60s of Afghanistan as two of just about 4 decades, which under King Zahir Shah was seen as peaceful, relatively. Otherwise, unfortunately, till the British left the Asian dominions, it was part of the first great game between the Britain and Tsarist Russia, and thereafter, from the time the Russians invaded Afghanistan again, from Christmas Eve 1979, you can say the second great game began. One has a very good recollection of some of the Afghan cadets in the National Defense Academy in the 60s, 70s, which is an indication of the amount of inter-services, contact that there was between Afghanistan and India. And it used to be, fun interacting with these Afghan cadets. Thereafter, of course, from the time the US coalition forces made their entry, anything and everything that India wanted to do, or was, asked by Afghanistan to do, there was always the factor of Pakistan trying to influence the US. Not going too far much into this, we have to now look at what appears to be a not very bright future. We've had the condition of Afghanistan as it was under the Taliban. The memories are still fresh in many of our minds. And with the American forces leaving now, and here was one country which always said it will stay the course. And by staying the course, it would probably have had the approval of many countries which which are well-wishers of Afghanistan. Anyway, with that being our topic, the near future, the distant future, I request Ambassador Mukhopadhaya to start.
Okay, shall I start?
Please.
Okay, thank you, Col Anil Bhat, for your very kind introduction. Since you began with a little bit of history, let me just also add that I have glimpsed, I should say, or slices of Afghanistan at three different periods of its recent history. I first traveled through Afghanistan as a student by land in 1977. This was, of course, post Zahir Shah. It was still the Daud Khan years, but it was before the Soviet intervention. At that time, I was purely traveling as a student, and I can tell you two of the kind of very lasting images that I have from that trip. Just to make the point that, you know, this kind of Islamic emirate is not a natural phenomenon in Afghanistan. And one of my first recollections was the sight of schoolgirls in light blue salwars and white dupattas and pajamas on the streets in the heart of Kabul. And later on, traveling by bus to Afghanistan, it was during Ramzan. One of the trips was during Ramzan. It was very common to see the bus being stopped and Afghans getting out of the bus and doing their daily prayers and coming back. But foreigners, the magic buses from Europe, schoolgirls in Kabul, open chai khanas and eating places, these were all part of the daily ordinary scenery without any disturbance from any quarter. The next time I landed there, it was in 2001, after the Northern Taliban, with the help of the CIA, ousted the Taliban from Kabul. And it was a picture of absolute devastation, the cumulative and combined damage done by the intra-Mujahideen fighting of the 90s, as well as the Taliban period, complete lack of development during the Taliban period, and then, of course, the US bombardment. And subsequently, I was there as ambassador for the longest stretch. That was from 2010 to 13, and I've been visiting Afghanistan regularly since then until 2019. So very quickly, since you've given us essentially 3 minutes, I'll say that the broad picture that we face today is that the US is withdrawing. The US is withdrawing and is looking for a kind of exit with 3 pillars. One pillar is a kind of inclusive Afghan government. Interim potentially
could you be slightly louder, please?
50% share.
Mr. Mukhopadhaya,
potentially
could you be slightly louder?
Yeah. Well, let me see if there's something wrong with the setting. Am I louder now?
Better.
Is it louder now? Okay. Right. So with a potentially 50-50 sharing, so there is one part which is an internal arrangement, a second part which is a regional process, and a third part which is kind of a UN-sponsored, a process on Afghanistan. But what is clearly missing from this is the factor that has been clear right from the beginning, from 2001, when Richard Armitage went to and met Musharraf, but also during the Obama period and finally in the South Asia strategy, that there is no strategy for Pakistan. And effectively, with the US pulling out, they are leaving the Islamic Republic both militarily and diplomatically in a weaker position, without addressing the Pakistani side of the equation vis-a-vis the Taliban. That means the US exits along with the kind of the technical support that it can provide for the Afghan Air Force, which is actually very instrumental in the battle right now. And it has stacked the diplomatic tables also very much in favor of the Taliban by the legitimization of the Taliban through the February 2020 US-Taliban deal, without any corresponding measures on the Pakistan side of the equation, the Pakistani support, shelter, logistics for the Taliban. So essentially, it puts the Islamic Republic and the Afghan government on a weak spot. And this has not been helped by the fact that you have a central government which is divided, which is weak, whose own legitimacy is relatively weak. Now, the kind of solution that the US is looking for the internal arrangement is also a kind of betrayal of democracy. Essentially, it is looking for a solution amongst the power brokers and the Taliban, and it is really contingent on whether this will hold or not. From whatever I know of the Taliban, it is very unlikely that they will abide by any kind of power sharing agreement. And sooner or later, they will make a bid for total takeover. It is unlikely that they will completely succeed because there will be pockets of resistance, both from old power brokers as well as from sizable sections within the ANDSF who will resist. And one of the quarters that we haven't factored into and the United States has not taken into account in a final internal settlement has been the entire new generation that has come of age since 2001. And we can definitely expect some resistance from those quarters as well. The outlines of that resistance are not yet clear, but they will become clear once we know the nature of the transition. So all in all, we are likely to face a very messy situation. One positive feature is that the United States will continue to remain politically engaged. But the danger with this kind of political engagement is that once the troops withdraw, and if the various elements that we have, on which I can talk later, don't work out very well, then the exasperation with Taliban will grow, and calls for withdrawal of financial aid and others may also grow. Noting particularly that President Biden was very clear in his speech that their focus has now shifted to counter-terrorism operations, not just in Afghanistan, but dispersed all over the world. And their primary challenge is China. So I'll end with that.
Thank you, Mr. Mukhopadhaya. General Sharma, like I mentioned earlier, like in the USI around 2002, we had the US Chief of Staff who addressed a fairly full auditorium there, and where one put the question to him that don't you feel you've dissipated your effort in Afghanistan by entering into Iraq also? He deferred, and then came this point about staying the course. Now, with them finally leaving, do you see the kind of authority that the Taliban had, which almost it was like medieval ages? Then Sharma.
Thank you very much, Colonel Anil, for inviting me here to participate in this very important discussion. In fact, India, that is USI and Afghan Institute of Strategic Studies, every year we conduct a sort of an annual strategic security dialogue, and one more that is the sixth one is due in the month of August. You see, what I intend doing, since you are giving us three opportunities, in the first I'll talk about the current security scenario. In the second, based on what other speakers have spoken, I'll talk about how the Afghan National Defense Security Forces and Taliban match up purely as the two sort of contesting forces. And in the third intervention, I may talk briefly about what is the security assistance that India can render to Afghanistan. In my first part, I would like to talk about few recent developments post the announcement by President Biden about troop withdrawal by 11th of September. Now, what has happened that that Taliban have refused to participate in the Istanbul process because there were two important things which were to happen there. One was the formation of interim government, and second was the ceasefire. And at this juncture, Taliban do not appear amenable to both these conditions. The second thing that has happened is Mr. Ghani has also, I think, dug in his heels, and he's announced that no matter what happens, he's the elected president and he's not going to yield or leave office till about 2024. The third development which has taken place is a tweet which was given by the Taliban spokesperson Tani Kazai, and he said in that we are hopeful that Afghan Taliban leadership will be removed from the terrorist list and remainder 7,000 Taliban will be released. And then came yesterday a press conference which was given by General Austin Miller in Kabul, in which he said that this withdrawal process has commenced and we are withdrawing from 12 odd bases. And there are a total of about 30,000 people who have to withdraw from there. 3,500 American troops, 7,000 odd American troops, and then you have a number of about 18,000 to 20,000 these civilian contractors of different countries who are also part of that withdrawal process. In the meanwhile, there is a fear that Taliban, having said that Americans have extended their stay till September, there is a kind of a fear that they may start attacking, or at least that is the kind of posturing that they are doing. And in anticipation, what Americans have done, they moved 652 bombers in the Gulf region. There's an aircraft carrier. They've also moved a Rangers unit in Afghanistan, and they have made a statement that we are ready to fight it out, but we will ensure that our withdrawal is smooth. But what is more worrisome is the assessment of the US National Intelligence Agency, in which they have said that probably in next 3 years, Taliban will be in a position to capture better part of Afghanistan, and they will be in a position to call shots. Now, this assessment becomes little more worrisome when you look at certain internal situation in Afghanistan, be that, the kind of, you have about 62% people are below the age of 25 there. Then you have the unemployment is about 55%. Then 70% or more of their economy is based on the foreign aid, and their total expenditure requirement is about $11 billion, out of which they are only able to muster about $2.5 billion. That means they would be in need of about $7 billion for several years to come for their very, very survival. And then, of course, there are other aspects, which is like, the socio-political polarization which has taken place within the Afghan, let's say, Ashraf Ghani's own setup, his relation with Abdullah within Pashtuns and between Pashtuns and non-Pashtuns. So the whole polity, the political setup of Afghanistan is not on the same page vis-a-vis Taliban, who are ascendant and who are on the rise. So this makes the scenario little more worrisome. And I would, in my next intervention, say that what are the strengths and weaknesses of Afghan National Defense and Security Forces vis-a-vis Taliban. And then, of course, I'll talk about other issues. So I think I'll limit my comments to this only at this juncture.
Thank you, General Sharma. Dr. Omar Sadr, it is indeed, we're very fortunate to have you amongst us, because I think most important is what we hear about Afghanistan from you. It's right from the horse's mouth, so to speak. How do you see things expected to shape out? Dr. Sadr, can you hear me?
All right. Thank you so much, Colonel Anil. Can you hear me? It's such a pleasure, and thank you for a pleasure to share the panel with Ambassador Mukhopadhaya and General Sharma. At the same time, I would like to extend my prayers and feelings to the people of India at this very difficult time that they are fighting horrendous kind of conflict, COVID across India. Well, let me also talk about implication of withdrawal of US troops on Afghanistan as well as in the region. So in the first section, I will try to focus on internal dynamics of Afghanistan and the implication of the withdrawal. In the second intervention, I will come to the region. Well, as we know, the United States troops and NATO are withdrawing in a time where the prospect for any kind of political settlement with Taliban are not very clear. And I suppose we need to focus on and evaluate the implications on three dimensions: the political dimensions in Afghanistan, second on economic dimension, and fourth on social dimension. On political dimension, what we hear is that it's not just the military troops withdrawing from Afghanistan, but there's a most chance, highly likely that a couple of embassies, probably European embassies, will also withdraw or limit.
Mr. Mukhopadhaya, continuing from where we left off, and now India's political diplomatic role there now, with after in a post American withdrawal and post more powerful Taliban scenario.
Okay, firstly, I would like to, really express my appreciation for General Sharma's initial security briefing. I think it covered a tremendous amount of ground, and I, captured all the points extremely well. As far as India's diplomatic choices are concerned, I think a lot depends on what is going to happen, either in the intra-Afghan talks, particularly in the intra-Afghan talks. If, for example, the intra-Afghan talks are to any extent successful, let us say that whether it's a US-sponsored process or a UN-sponsored process, or it's just an Afghan-sponsored process, that the Afghans, along with the Taliban, are able to come to some kind of, even if it's not fully democratic, solution. That means a power sharing arrangement. Then, in terms of being able to deal with the Taliban in the context of an Afghan peace process, I don't think there would be any problem. Of course, bearing in mind that there will be some groups that we will possibly engage with, and some groups that we will continue to be suspicious of. For example, it's very difficult to contemplate any kind of arrangement or cooperation with the Haqqani network and the various kind of other outfits that accompany them. The Taliban, from their point of view also, have been actually fairly careful not to be too critical of India. And on issues, something happened? And continuing. And on issues of sort of us that includes Kashmir, they have largely distanced themselves from the kind of Pakistani position as well. But that doesn't mean that cooperation with the Taliban is likely to be smooth. Now, various countries have dealt with the Taliban for different motivations. By and large, the Americans, Russians, to some extent the Iranians, have acted vis-a-vis the Taliban behind the back of the Afghan government. This is not something that we have done. We have engaged with this process only after the intra-Afghan talks, only with the intra-Afghan talks in Doha in September, when we said that we will support the process and we look forward to a positive outcome. So I don't think that we will see any kind of initiative on our part that tries to reach a deal with the Taliban behind the backs of the Afghan people and the Afghan Republic. However, we would be willing, we would be happy to cooperate and play a part in bringing all the sides together to have a peaceful negotiated settlement, including a power sharing agreement, with the proviso that we are not very optimistic about such an arrangement holding out. As a result of which, we will be watching the Afghan situation very carefully, whether it holds onto some kind of negotiated settlement or breaks down. And it's difficult to forecast what that situation could be at this point of moment, because there is no unified leadership, there is no unified resistance we can think of. But I would say overall our interests lie with the new generation of Afghans. If at all there is the struggle in Afghanistan continues, we would not like to see it in ethnic terms. We would not like it to break down into north-south or ethnic terms. We would rather see it in terms of the new generation and the Taliban. But we also have to keep in mind that opposition to the Taliban is by and large in the urban areas amongst the youth. There is also opposition to the Taliban in the rural areas and among the Pashtuns, but their ability to live with the Taliban will be greater than the ability of many of the minorities, women, and youth in the cities. And therefore, there will be a kind of fault line at that point, at that level. So we have to keep our options open. We should support the peace process. In case the peace process does not succeed, we have to be prepared with alternative plans. Much will depend on the situation on the ground as well as the international situation at that time.
See, I would pick up the thread from where Ambassador Mukhopadhaya left. You know, he's very clearly brought out that while militarily Taliban may have an edge, but their acceptability in the civil society who have tasted democracy in last 20 years is very much a suspect. It's not the same old Afghanistan when the Mujahideens were fighting and there was total lawlessness, and then these people came as Robin Hoods and they caught the imagination of people till they showed their true colors and when people had rejected them. But what is important that we cannot underestimate the fighting potential of Taliban. After all, despite Americans having deployed 1,000 troops and on very sustained basis with the best of technology, they have survived and they have showed the resilience.
Yes.
That has to be accepted. Now, what is this Taliban actually? This is not a monolith. It is actually a kind of a polythic terrorist network. On the whole, there are about 20 groups there, out of which Taliban groups per se are 8. And out of those 8, the most formidable one is the Haqqani network. So therefore, to paint the whole Taliban movement with one brush is actually, it is very, very misleading and people don't understand here. Now, what has happened that Taliban are at the moment structurally much better organized than they were when they were at the helm of affairs. Over the years, they have refined and they have a very well structured system. They have, you know, this Shura, particularly, you know, you have the Peshawar Shura there, and then they have other Quetta Shura and all that. And within that, they have jurists and they have the military people there. Now, their military units are actually at the 2 levels. One is what you call is the mobile fighting units, which are estimated to be about 50,000, and they comprise about an age group of 16 to 25 years of people. And these people keep rotating, you know, they get deployed from their safe havens from Pakistan, get deployed and then go for rest and relief. So they're able to keep them in good strength, in good energy. Then they have about 150,000 plus what is called the Taliban militias, Islamic militias, which are totally embedded in Afghan society in the areas where they are dominating. In addition to that, they have a very well defined, what you can call is the social infrastructure. For example, you have these shadow organizations. You have the provincial governors, you have the district governors, you have the police and investigation agencies, you have Ummah, justice, education, health, finance, and even they are dealing with the NGOs. So there's a very elaborate system. That means they can fill the void wherever they are able to sort of prevail from the security point of view. They have no dearth of money because they are raising a lot of money from the poppy cultivation in this Taliban dominated area. As much as about 52% poppy cultivation comes from there. They've also been able to gain control over some of these areas which are very rich in the mineral resources. And there is no dearth of weapons because some of the weapons they get from the deserters. Others are coming from ISI, and even some other countries are supplying them weapons. So they are in a way, and they have a very good strategy in work, that how should they be inching towards the communication centers, sphere the arteries which are connecting the communication centers. And today they have almost strangulated some of these communication centers from where these Afghan National Defense Security Forces have withdrawn. Now let's come to Afghan National Defense Security Forces. After 2015, 95% of the operations were being done by Afghans themselves. And despite a very heavy casualty rate, which is to the tune about 60,000 people in last about 7 years. They have given a very good account of themselves, and their mainstay is their commandos, the special forces, their air force, which is still at a very nascent stage, though they have a shortfall of intelligence, logistic support, casualty evacuation, and communication. This support was very, very crucial because particularly the air support was coming from the NATO and the US forces. Now, bereft of this support, this is going to create a problem for the national defense and security forces, right? And their casualty rate is not going to be sustainable. So they need a very big help for to keep the whole country together. There are intrinsic fault lines within the Afghan national defense and security forces because 44% are Pashtun, 56% are non-Pashtun, and out of this Tajiks, they dominate both the leadership in the police and the military. Suppose, God forbids, tomorrow there is a fragmentation of Afghanistan society on ethnic lines. It may have its ripple effect on Afghan national defense and security forces, and that will very seriously impinge their fighting capabilities vis-a-vis Taliban, who are much better organized. Though Americans are thinking of having some intelligence-based militias in one odd base there, and they are looking at over the horizon kind of a strategy wherein they can use the aircraft and drones and such like other things like what they've been doing in some of the African countries. Whether that is sustainable or not, it's a moot point. What is more important is what Ambassador Mukhopadhaya said, that first we must keep the Afghan national defense security forces intact, and second most important thing is all countries have to sort of not suck up to the Taliban, but press or assert for intra-Afghan peace dialogue. I'll leave it at that, and maybe
Wanted to speak on the implications of withdrawal internally on Afghanistan in three dimensions. The first is, of course, political and military dimension. On that, it's very clear that the withdrawal will clearly have negative implications on political order and the trust of the people on political system. What I see currently in Kabul, at least, is a kind of general sense of panic and anxiety of what will happen of the withdrawal of the troops. And that is, of course, very understandable, because the withdrawal of military would be accompanied by excavation of political missions, including the European missions from Kabul. Second important issue is that, unfortunately, as it was mentioned by Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, the political leadership is not in a position to unify, unfortunately. And that's one of the key causes or fears that we will have of the withdrawal. On economic dimensions, of course, the funding will reduce, despite the fact that the United States promised that they will continue to support. There would be increase in number of job securities and joblessness will increase. Investments will reduce in Afghanistan. Already a number of investors are getting out of the country, either to Turkey or Middle East. And that, of course, impacts socially. That will have a third implication and a third angle with job insecurity and all that. That will, of course, will lead to some sort of influx of refugees in the region. So people, there is an estimate that more than 1 lakh will excavate Afghanistan and will move to the neighboring countries. So all of these together, of course, will have very dark impact on political order. And there's an increased chance of state fragmentation. There is a number of consensus on a number of issues, but of course not in all aspects. The number one issue is consensus in region with respect to the unacceptability of Emirate, the Taliban political system, and of course that no one in the region wants a Taliban-dominated state post-withdrawal. This includes stable Afghanistan. Their long-term interest is to keep a weak Afghanistan. Of course, the Pakistan has pronounced that they are in favor of a political settlement, which includes Taliban. But however, a future government for Pakistan will be the one which should be dominated by Taliban or their like-minded, if not Taliban themselves. The second dimension of consensus at the region is that there should be a government which should be inclusive enough and representative of the people of Afghanistan. Now, what should be the model of that government? That's not quite clear. Whether that should be a Republican or not, that's not much clear. The third dimension is security in the region. Of course, almost all the neighboring countries, the Central Asians and Iranian government, India, is concerned about the prospect of security of the withdrawal. The Central Asian countries, of course, they have much, and most of them are active across the border in the north. So that somehow increases the anxiety of the neighboring countries, particularly the northern Central Asian republics, about how the withdrawal of troops will impact their security. And this has been raised in a recent visit of President Ghani in Tajikistan, that Tajikistan president has promised any kind of cooperation with Afghanistan, but however, he demanded that government in Afghanistan should do their best to secure the border with Tajikistan and the north. The fourth dimension, which is, I think there is also somehow a consensus in the region, is the positive role of Afghanistan when it comes to economic development in the region, because of the central position that Afghanistan has in terms of geopolitical and the way it connects Central Asia with South Asia. It's very clear that a stable Afghanistan is still what we don't understand and we don't know much as the prospect of a political deal with the Taliban. Taliban has already shown, and that is understandable because the withdrawal of the troops or the announcement of the withdrawal has encouraged Taliban to take a harsher stance, and their assumption is that they can militarily dominate Kabul. With the withdrawal of the troops, Kabul will not be in a position to defend, and hence Taliban will have a higher chance. However, my understanding is that even if Taliban will dominate militarily, the region will not recognize a government which is established by Taliban, including the states which earlier recognized Taliban, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and the Gulf states. So no one will recognize Taliban, and I think Taliban also appreciate this fact that they cannot rule Afghanistan unilaterally themselves, while international community and the region does not back their government. But what we need at the moment is, of course, a unified political stance in Kabul, a leadership which should bring different segments of the society and political parties a strong front against the Taliban. So that unfortunately, I do not see such kind of.
Could you throw some light on any prospect of the proportion of Taliban versus the Afghan mainstream political parties, or power sharing?
Well, on that, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
On
yes.
that, well, on that, what was proposed earlier, it was 50-50 between the Republic and the Emirate. That was somehow problematic. As you know, the nature of conflict in Afghanistan is quite complicated. It's not as simple as Republic versus Emirate.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so the conflict, of course, has an ethno-national dimension to it. And the assumption is that if we divide the power sharing, if we design the power sharing based on 50-50, that will overweight certain ethno-national groups versus the others. Because it's very clear that Taliban predominantly they are representing, or they are consist of, if they are not representing, they are consist of Pashtuns, absolute majority somehow. On the other side, the Republic also, you will have the technocrat section of the Pashtun community who will also have a share. So that will overweight Pashtuns versus others. So the alternative proposals came from other constituencies. For instance, the political strongmen who are represented in the High Reconciliation Council, for them, they have designed a different setup wherein there should be 1/3 representation from the Taliban, 1/3 from the Republic, and 1/3 from the rest of the politicians who are out of the government. So that will somehow bring a kind of balance when it comes to distribution of power. Now, that's one dimension, which only emphasizes on how to distribute the central administration. However, there's also a strong demand and tendency to demand a kind of decentralization of power in order to diffuse what we have administratively, politically, and financially in Kabul, and transfer it across the provinces. So in order to somehow check and balance the power of very strong president currently that Afghanistan has. Primarily Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras, they are in favor of a decentralized system. Now in that also there are different models on how to design or the decentralization or how to devolve the power. While Tajiks predominantly, they are in favor of a parliamentary system, which was quite outdated, and the proposal which was unified by Yunus Qanuni and the High Reconciliation Council. However, the other ethnic groups, particularly Hazaras and Uzbeks, they are much more in favor of decentralized system, but at the same time, some of them has emphasized support for a presidential system. Because for minority groups like Uzbeks and Hazaras, it's much more important to have local autonomy rather than a share in Kabul, because they understand that they cannot win the game if there is two kind of distribution of power between a position which is called president and another position which is called prime minister. So still consultations are going on, but what we can at least sum up the current scenario is that 50-50 between the Republic and the Emirate is not somehow reflecting
the realities on the ground. And of course, that will overrepresent certain segments of the society over the others. We need to think about other modalities. But of course, the other question is whether the Taliban really represent a segment of Pashtuns in Afghanistan or not. That is a contention within the Pashtun community, because the technocrats claim the representation themselves, but on the other side, you have the Taliban who does not recognize the authority and capacity of the technocrat Pashtuns to represent the community. Now, of course, no one would like the Taliban to represent Pashtun ethnicity as their representative. Of course, that will be a kind of setback for all of us, not only Pashtuns, but for the rest of the country as well. But now, of course, we cannot ignore the political and military weight that the Taliban represent now. So now the question would be how to balance the power between the technocrat Pashtuns and the fundamentalist Pashtuns, now namely the Taliban, right? That will be a question.
I'll request you to elaborate on this on your next when you speak. Mr. Mukhopadhaya, what do you have to say about very fair amount of interesting inputs put across by Dr. Omar Sadr?
Yeah. No, firstly, I would like to thank both General Sharma and Omar Sadr. I think both made very valid, very interesting points and some very interesting elaborations and on the discussions around the power sharing formula. Let me just make a couple of observations. I will also address the issue of power sharing a little later. One is, I think we need to understand, we should be aware that Taliban 1.0 and Taliban 2.0 are going to be two very different animals. Taliban 1.0 came as a pious stabilizing force under the figurehead, under the leadership of Mullah Omar, who all said and done was widely respected in that area. And the background to that was the intra-Mujahideen fighting. Taliban 2.0 is coming more or less as a kind of creature of Pakistan, supported by Pakistan, not unified under one single authoritative spiritual leadership like that of Mullah Omar, quite clearly, faction driven. And its legitimacy has come entirely and almost entirely through terrorism, not and through fear. To the extent that even rural Afghanistan may be under their sway, a lot of it is to do with I think, exasperation with the corruption and malpractices of local level authorities in Afghanistan, but on the other hand also the sheer terror and fear that they have been able to. And two other points that are important here. One is, I think, as Omar Sadr said, that if they do not dilute their notion of an emirate, which is not acceptable to practically anyone, even Saudi Arabia, which was one of their great backers in the past, has changed now, then international recognition will be very difficult. And of course, clearly the Taliban this time not only want international recognition, they also want international assistance and cooperation. And that technically is a kind of lever that they can use. Secondly, they have completely not understood how Afghanistan has changed over the last 20 years, particularly this phenomenon of the new generation. And they are giving absolutely no space to the political, you can say, aspirations of this class, which by and large, of course, power brokers and others completely write off. But I don't think it will be completely written off. Second, as far as Pakistan is concerned, the fact is Pakistan knows very well that, while they may be able to use the Taliban or whatever, in the olden days, it was the Mujahideen, while they were in Pakistan, the moment they leave Pakistan and come to Afghanistan, two things happen. One is, of course, they tend to break up amongst themselves, and there are much more intra-factional, frictions. And the second is that they tend to adopt a certain kind of independence from their handlers in Pakistan. This is what happened in 92, 96, and it's almost certain to happen once again. Pakistan knows this very well. So Pakistan actually has a vested interest in having different factions, different forces in the game, and perpetuating a kind of level of instability whereby there is no unified authority in Afghanistan that can tackle Pakistan by itself. And a third difference linked to the first 2 points is that in 1992, the Taliban, Pakistan was a hero, having supported the resistance through the Soviet intervention. Today, it is exactly the opposite. Pakistan is not even a good word amongst the Pashtuns. Third, one very great danger of the regional process. The Americans are basically trying to exit. They are trying to outsource and sort of delegate or, dispute their responsibility in the world, in the UN, amongst the region, and amongst Afghans. But the balance of power within the region has also changed a lot. In 2010-11, when we began the Heart of Asia process, China was nowhere, Russia was nowhere, Pakistan was on the docks. It was still seen as a sponsor of Taliban terrorism. And the remaining countries of the Heart of Asia process, basically Pakistan was very much a focus of interest. Now what has happened is, with China behind Pakistan, Russia more or less, wanting to see the US out and also the Taliban in some degree or the other, Iran coming under part of this kind of anti-Western axis, really the balance of power in the regional process will have shifted much more to what we can call, what at least I could call here, from our point of view, spoilers. And the second fact is that, in the regional process, it's very easy to magnify the bilateral differences, let's say India-Pakistan differences, and then blame the region for not pulling its weight. And this is what was one of the problems of the Heart of Asia process, that, the Heart of Asia process completely excluded the West and the US. They had a different term. They were not observers, but they had some secondary status. They were not actually in the negotiations. And therefore, they were not able to apply the kind of weight that they were able to apply to the countries of the region to ensure that there was a certain direction. So there is that data that once again, a regional process will contribute to kind of an internal, there will be an internal mess, and then there will be a regional mess. And the Americans will say, okay, look, these guys can't do anything by themselves. We are losing out. Leave it to the UN if the UN can find a solution. And remember, the outcome of the last time the UN was involved in the Geneva Accords, they brokered an agreement. But after that, there was no monitoring mechanism. There was no implementing mechanism. And the rest of the world lost interest. So we don't want that to happen once again. And another point that Omar made, an unified political position. This really internally is the big factor in Afghanistan. And there is simply no unified internal position, except on this one point, which is actually quite remarkable, that nobody wants to abandon the Islamic Republic and nobody wants to lose the gains of the last 20 years. However, they are not able to get together in terms of leadership, in terms of distribution. And I think Omar has done a wonderful job in explaining some of the complexities behind power sharing. So where does that leave us? Overall, that leaves us with the very bleak prospects of agreements. And even if agreements are held, and I certainly believe that the Taliban sense victory, they are not, one basic precondition for a kind of peaceful settlement is both sides feel that they cannot prevail over the other. And therefore, they have to come to some kind of compromise. That seems to be missing in this case. We have the Afghan Republic side that is desperate for peace after 20 years, but you have the Taliban side, which is actually sensing victory and sensing that many of its enemies, the United States in particular, are now, either neutral or almost in its side. In fact, the US-Taliban deal, I would say, effectively handed over Afghanistan, allowing for a certain process to the Taliban and eventually Pakistan. And this time it will not just be Pakistan; it will be Pakistan backed by China, at the very least.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so I think this is the kind of, and therefore the prospects of any kind of peace in Afghanistan look to me extremely bleak. However, we cannot give up on this, and we must keep trying. And one silver lining on that, I think again, Omar may have referred to this because some of the sound was not clear, is that one difference between Trump and Biden is that while both Trump and Biden favor a military pullout, Biden does remain more committed to the counterterrorism strategy, even if it's over the horizon. But more importantly, they have been at pains to say that they will remain politically engaged. With Trump, there was not even that degree of political engagement. And therefore, if this political engagement can be kept, which means that they don't, cut and run, even politically, let alone militarily, then there is a broad basis for countries like India, the United States. At some stage, Iran is going to be a very important partner, and to be able to broad base some kind of international interest in Afghanistan. And finally, one of the great failures of state building in the last 20 years is that while a lot of money has been poured into Afghanistan through the ISAF and through the international presence, there has been really very little effort at building up a sustainable economy. The basic preconditions for that existed. The mineral resources, that mineral wealth of Afghanistan, which could have been invested in and converted into revenues for the state. General Sharma's very graphic point about the budget requirement and what Afghanistan is able to raise by itself. And secondly, also invest in the primary products of Afghanistan. That includes its horticultural products and many other rural assets that could easily be commercialized into making Afghanistan a much more trade-worthy country. And of course, linked to that is the sheer connectivity with the Indian market, because there is no question that in the region and beyond, India is the lodestar that could be the engine that could drive the Afghan economy. So, this is one area where there has been a big failure. But even as we look ahead, I think this is an area where we have to look, because the Afghan state has to be sustainable. It has to have much more, it has to have a revenue stream. And that revenue stream has to be consciously built up. Pardon me.
Thank you, Mr. Mukhopadhaya. Then Sharma, could you throw some light on now, what more further role can there be for India's armed forces between, Afghan and India's armed forces?
Yeah. Before
any other points that you have?
No, before I get on to that, I'd like to build up on what Ambassador Mukhopadhaya said.
Yes.
From my perspective, I think next 5 years, we are going to see intense fighting in Afghanistan. Because if they have not listened to Americans, then even at times they are even showing fingers to even Russians. For
Yes,
example, Russians
yes,
have come very
yes.
openly and they said, we do not want an emirate, Islamic emirate in Afghanistan. And even Iran was sidelined, when the Moscow talks took place. So Iran is also not very happy that you have a Sunni, Wahhabi-based ideological dispensation coming up just next door. You have one already coming up to their north and another coming here. So these countries at the moment, just they want to see America out, but in the long run, these problems are going to crop up between Taliban and some of these other countries. They are not very happy. Now, what has happened? If you look at the ground situation, whether we like or not, Pakistan has already created the fencing of 95% of Durand line, and the access and entry control is totally in Pakistani hands there. And the areas which are contiguous to Durand line are being dominated by Haqqani network. So they are the de facto rulers in the eastern and the southern provinces of Afghanistan. As against in the past, they've also made certain headways in the western provinces of Herat. And even in the northern Afghanistan, you see how they made a number of attempts in Kunduz and that Badakhshan area. So they have been able to create non-Pashtun proxies whose interest for the time being are aligned with that of Taliban. Likewise, they have some kind of a love and hate relationship with the Islamic State. While in the south, they've been fighting with Islamic State in the area of Nangarhar, but in the north, they have undertaken certain joint this thing. So situation is extremely in a state of flux. Now, my point of view, what probably Taliban are going to do is, like they say, Americans have the watches and we have the time. They are not in a hurry for a dramatic solution, let me tell you this, because things are actually going their way. What they would like to do, they would further consolidate their influence in the western and the northern part of Afghanistan, because they don't want another beeline being made for Kabul. What Ahmad Shah Massoud had done and Rabbani was installed there. And then he made a very strong resistance line along the Panjshir Valley. This time, Taliban, if they want to control, they want to overcome some of these past mistakes. Therefore, I think they are going to make leadership assassination attempts. Suppose they made number of attempts on Saleh in the past. They made attempts on Ghani. Suppose these are the two rallying points today. If these two rallying points, they are somehow able to destabilize, and within the existing dispensation, there is some kind of a race for the political leadership. They've already opened channels with General Atta. Some kind of a hobnobbing is taking place with Ismail Khan and other kind of things. So things are in a very fluid state. Then is the Islamic State, which is also fighting side by side. You know, they have problems. So I think for next 4 to 5 years, India should be prepared to look at a very, very violent scenario in this thing. Now the question is, we have to first protect ourselves. Wherever our remainder 3 consulates are, our embassy, wherever our people are projecting. And next thing, today, the holding point in Afghanistan is the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. If they collapse or they get weakened, then you will get the whole of Afghanistan on a platter to Taliban, even if they will not have the public support, but they will rule it. And there are so many examples in the world where the people have been ruling without the public support. Therefore, what India perhaps should do, that while we keep pressing for this intra-Afghan dialogue and things like that, we have to be very, very nimble-footed and absolutely flexible in our approach, and keep watching the situation, and at the same time, keep building up the capacity of Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. Because if they collapse, then everything collapses. Side by side, I think we must also put across to Taliban that should they come in power sharing arrangement, today we have 116 projects in 31 provinces there, and nobody else has that much of an experience of civil capacity building and peace building in Afghanistan. So we can offer them our good services, that look, nobody else will be able to do it. We can do it for you, provided you behave in a respectable manner as important stakeholders. In terms of, I think, security assistance, we cannot go above board because there are attendant risks. I don't want to talk about it, you know, pumping in weapons and other things. But we can help them in counter-terrorism, particularly in urban areas, intelligence gathering, better management of the security grid, because the Indian experience in this is flawless. So some of these best practices that India has imbibed due to its long involvement in CI and CT operations, these can be shared with the Afghans, because presently they are copycatting the American concepts and American way of fighting, which is not conducive for a situation in Afghanistan. So there is a more and more effort required in the capacity building and training of Afghan national leadership, and in terms of other non-lethal support and our moral support to them. So I think we must continue with our effort and see that no matter what power sharing arrangement comes in Afghanistan, Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, they remain the rallying point of a new Afghanistan.
Thank you, Sharma. We, I know that we have had a very, apart from, any troop deployment there, there's been a lot of interaction on the on training, information technology, in other non-military areas also. But now, with it, there's a feeling of uncertainty as to exactly how things are going to, work out. Dr. Sadr was very kind in, pointing out about the power agreement or the power arrangement or the power sharing agreement. Anything on this, Mr. Mukhopadhaya?
Yeah, I think a couple of just additional points, and I would love to hear Mr. Sadr, Dr. Sadr also after me. I think one is, we should not forget that in the kind of discussion and focus on talks and the future, we should not ever forget where the source of the problem is. And therefore, if solutions need to be found, the source of the problem is in Pakistan. So while we have put pressure on the Taliban and on the ceasefire issue and on recognition and things like this, I don't think at any point of time, in fact, we should step up. There are people, even in the United States, who are very well aware of this, that the source of the problem in Pakistan should not be lost sight of. And the second thing is, I think, again, General Sharma made some very fine points, and I totally agree with him. And there are lots of things that we can do in Afghanistan. But I think we should also strengthen what we can do for Afghans in India. If the next 5 years are going to be so unstable as General Sharma and I also think so, then, even if we are not very active, we cannot be very active in Afghanistan. As Fawzia Kufi once said, India is already in Afghanistan, in the hearts. And Afghans will want to come to India for business, for medical treatment, for education, even for shelter from instability there. And even though, currently, for example, we are only allowing medical visas, X visas have been closed, we must think ahead and we must have a hospitable arrangement to be able to continue to develop the new generation of Afghans. We have invested 20 years in them. They are our biggest assets. They are also the future of Afghanistan. And this instability, last time it was 5 years of Taliban, and then we had 20 years of post-Taliban, post-born arrangement. So we shouldn't forget, these things can be cyclical. They may come on top for 2, 3, 4, 5 years perhaps, but at the end of it, resistance will build up. They are not on the side of history. And the side of history is the youth and the future. And I think that is where we should invest, and we should create a much more congenial and positive environment for them to be able to find opportunity in India, so that they are an asset for Afghanistan as well as for India-Afghan relations in future. So I think these are the 2 points that I wanted to make. There are things we can do in Afghanistan. They may be limited, but there's a lot more we can do by opening our hearts and arms in India. And that will definitely yield dividends in the future.
General Sharma, Mr. Mukhopadhaya, thank you very much for your inputs. Dr. Sadr, is there any scope of getting another few minutes with you?
Sure, of course. If I may.
Yes, please.
Would like to reflect on a couple of points mentioned by Ambassador and General. Number one, on the first issue, which I think Ambassador Mukhopadhaya talked about, Taliban 1.0 and 2.0. I totally underscore what he mentioned, the 3 differences, that how currently Taliban do not have a unified spiritual legitimacy, and their legitimacy is coming from terrorism. But at the same time, how the recent version of Taliban is seen as a creator of Pakistan. However, we should not forget the fact that what unifies the earlier version of Taliban and the current one is their ideological stream. And in both, what you don't see any much difference. Of course, the earlier Taliban was a mixture of Deobandi Islam plus some codes of conduct of tribal built in the southern Afghanistan. That still remains the same. However, that has become much more radical as they have been mixing beyond Deobandi Islam with streams of Salafi stream also. So, and that it's evident in their policies and their how they treat and conduct governance in a couple of districts that they are controlling, either in the south or the north. That's number one. Second, on the 5 years of intense fighting, which was raised by General Sharma, that's a longer picture, of course, and that's that I totally agree with. But what we need to focus is, I think, next 1 year, which is quite detrimental for all of us here in Kabul, and the risk of state collapse. All of us, I think, together should put hands with hands in order to prevent some sort of a state collapse, because all indications that I earlier mentioned, unfortunately, are guiding us toward kind of a weak statehood. And that therein it comes the responsibility of India. I think I see some of the indications that India is coming out of their old stance, which was somehow reluctant regional power, and taking some bold steps in order to support ANDSF security forces, because I totally understand and I agree with both panelists that if the state is continued to exist, that the number one factor would be, of course, the security forces. But beyond that one, unlike what General Sharma emphasized, I think the idea of political legitimacy is also very detrimental. It's not, of course, we have models of states which are ruling the people without their consent, but it will be quite difficult for a state which is bankrupt, for a state which is a entire state, and it's dependent on almost all dimensions to foreign assistance. So I think it will be quite difficult for political leadership in Kabul if they don't get public trust and public support. And that's what we need to work with the leadership here on how to expand it. The last point about the Biden administration and how they have pronounced certain form of political engagement with Afghanistan. And here I somehow doubt this, because personally Biden has some sort of biasness towards Pakistan. Earlier, he has time and again has pronounced that, and at the same time he doesn't have any trust on the projects of nation building. He so many times he said that, well, this country was never a unified nation and it's not responsibility of the US. My fear is that once again, what happens if the US relies on Pakistan and the region and hand over case of Afghanistan to Pakistanis, and because of the movement of the embassies, which may take place, I don't know, in a few months. That means that even politically, the gravity will shift from Kabul, and it will move on to embassies. Of course, I don't know, the embassies will shift to either they have two options, either to shift to Pakistan or to some Central Asian republic. So that's one of the fears, that how can we mitigate some of the side effects of such kind of political thinking, and Biden administration and the Biden himself. And last point, I think, is about Taliban and how we should not, we shall not misunderstand the nature of the movement. The movement is, of course, coming from a radical religious background, but at the same time, it has a strong ethno-nationalist element to it, which is somehow same as 90s, and I don't think that's different, because unfortunately the US negotiating team has misunderstood and miscalculated the nature of Taliban movement. Their assumption was that the Taliban are ready for a political settlement, and hence we can talk with them, we can negotiate with them. And what you see now, not only in the political negotiating team in Qatar, but also here in Afghanistan, and how they treat what, for example, with the schools, how they treat with the woman's appearance in public spaces, right? That is totally showing the nature of a dogmatic fundamentalist religious movement. And the other second angle is, of course, their ethnocentrism, which is somehow also underestimated, unfortunately. And if we do not take both of these clearly, that will be risky, whatever kind of settlement it comes. And then I will stop with this last point, that how India should engage. Of course, India should come forward to support ANDSF. That's number one important point. And secondly, I also support the point that Ambassador Mukhopadhaya said, that how India should be open and receiving, for example, if in case something happens in Kabul, the collapse or something, that to receive some of the recent new generation, which has positive image of India, and of course they don't have anywhere else to rely on in the region except India. That would be an option. So two things. First of all, India should help us to prevent any form of a state collapse, and secondly, to be prepared for any other scenario which might come up. And I will stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Omar Sadr.
From my side, I would just like to add that the points are very well taken.
Yes, Mr. Mukhopadhaya.
No, I just wanted to say that Dr. Sadr's points are well taken.
Yeah, yes. I must thank him for some of them were very, very relevant and very significant. There's so much more that can be dwelt on, but I think we'll end this here with the hope that, as it happened when the American coalition forces came and suddenly Indian films started getting shown, barbershops opened. I hope these, and for women, we sincerely hope this does not happen again. And it's not going to be easy, but all we can do is, look forward and to as good an arrangement that can come. Thank you very much, Mr. Mukhopadhaya, General Sharma, and Dr. Omar Sadr.
Thank you so much. It was an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good to see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.